Okay, yeah, thank you for inviting me and for having me. I'm very happy to talk to you today. I hope you're going to find it interesting. It's, I warn you, it's going to be really philosophical and also very semiotic. Semiotics being one discipline in philosophy, right? The science of signs, sign, S-I-G-N-S. But hopefully also enough of a theory of film and new media and documentary to be interesting for you guys. Okay, so let's get started. Wait. I want to start with something, with a short reflection on reality, actually, because I think it's by default that we all move through this world with an idea of what reality is, or at least with a feeling that there is something that deserves to be called reality. And perhaps the concept of fiction only exists because we do have some natural sense for reality as that which exists independently of what we think about it, but also independently of how we think. Reality as something that is independent of the way our thinking works. Yeah? We will have the occasion to look at this definition more closely in a few minutes. It's actually not my definition, but Charles Peirce's definition. You will hear a lot about Charles Peirce too today. So the interesting thing with reality is, however, that no philosopher nor any scientist or other researcher or thinker has been able to sufficiently prove that there is something like that. Yeah? No one can be sure if this world that we perceive as real is actually the way we perceive it. If you look skeptically at the definition of reality that I just gave you as being independent of how we think or of how our minds work, then reality, actually this very definition then already rules out the possibility that reality could actually be the way we perceive it, because it has to be structurally different from us. So there's a contradictory moment in that. And nothing else is actually the essence of Immanuel Kant's transcendental philosophy, namely to show that the way we conceive of reality implies that it is what maybe causes or steers our perceptions, but not what our perceptions or thoughts can render. Yeah? To put it differently, that there must be something that can be perceived, that steers perception, but that this something is hidden behind our perceptions. In other words, Kant's philosophy is actually the perfect brain in a vat or matrix philosophy. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. We all have heard of this, of course, and you all know this, but let's look at it quickly again because it's so fascinating. I hope the sound is loud enough. It wasn't really when I tested it. Where can we? Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you.
How would you know the difference between a dream
Great.
and a real? This kid. In what? In real?
It's going into replication.
Hey, Bob, still nothing. Let's go. Let's go. Tank, we're going to need a signal soon.
Active relation.
A5, location. Target almost there.
It's going into arrest.
Lock, I got him. Now, Tank, now.
Okay, so you all know where this is going. The problem with such a radical philosophical skepticism is that there can be no empirical evidence for or against it, of course, because the argument undermines empirical evidences themselves. So even if we could go outside the vat, the question would remain at a higher level. What we have to infer from this is, of course, that both philosophical realism and philosophical skepticism are dogmatic positions. The question is then, why does common sense profess reality at all? Why do we all have this concept? I believe that this question can actually be replaced by the question, why don't we just feel free? Why don't we just feel free from an object world that is not the ego, that's not just you or your thoughts, feelings, constructions? Well, I guess the answer is simple. It's because we all frequently experience something that we don't necessarily like. We haven't chosen to experience what we experience. It's not just what we construct or what we would like to happen that actually happens. And this is where we get our notion of reality as being mind independent from. So yesterday, actually, when I prepared the talk, or the rest of the talk, I asked myself if this means or implies that the documentarists, documentary filmmakers, of which a few, I assume, are sitting here right now, are actually only concerned with the representation of the unfree part of life, the thing that we don't like. That would be kind of sad, though. Well, let's look at one quote by Charles Peirce that is a good definition of reality. A man may walk down Wall Street debating within himself the existence of an external world, but if in his brown study he jostles up against somebody who angrily draws off and knocks him down, the skeptic is unlikely to carry his skepticism so far as to doubt whether anything besides the ego was concerned in that phenomenon. The resistance shows him that something independent of him is there. When anything strikes upon the senses, the mind's train of thought is always interrupted. For if it were not, nothing would distinguish the new observation from a fancy. So the key words here are resistance, and also strikes upon and senses, but also thought, and the interruption of it through perception. Perception, Peirce argues in another one of his writings, is not merely, I quote, a passing of images before the mind's eye, much as if one were walking through a picture gallery, end of quote. If this was the case, if perception was merely a representational, mirroring registration of qualia, reality would probably never have occurred to us at all. So rather than being an affair of iconicity, I suggest that perception is, and so it is for Peirce, according to my reading of Peirce, an affair of indexicality. And at this point, I'd like to give you a quick overview. It's also on your handouts of the three types of signs or signness as we find them in Peirce's semiotics. So this is just a very short introduction. A sign is always a triadic entity or phenomenon, according to Peirce, with a representamen. This is the representational part of it. For instance, well, this bottle doesn't really signify so much, but the body of the bottle would be the representamen of the sign. The object, if we now decide that this sign, the bottle, maybe signifies whatever, water, or even thirst in another way, maybe, then that would be the object. And the interpretant is the interpreting idea behind it. It's not some interpreter, it's not a person interpreting it, but it's really the idea that makes it logical, that renders it a sign. And then we have those three types. We have the icon, iconicity, I just mentioned it. I think that perception is not primarily an icon, it's primarily an index. It's not primarily a picture. So here we have a picture, for instance, this nice painting, Impressionist painting. What does it actually, the representamen are here, What does it signify? What is its object? The object is actually almost the same thing in the case of an icon as the representamen, or the exact same thing as in a déjà vu, for instance, which would also be an iconic sign. And the interpretant is the same thing as the object. Very often in icons, the interpretant and the object spring up at the same time. You just have to look at a picture and you get it. A 2-year-old child can understand this sign as an iconic sign. There's no explanation needed. This is why It's an intrinsic relation between the representamen and the object. There's an automatic interpretant. And the code is analogy. Yeah? The signification in icons runs through resemblance. And then we have the index, which I believe is more important for perception. A nice example is the weathercock that signifies the direction of the wind indexically. And it's caused by the wind. This is why I put this first. Yeah? The wind causes the weathercock to become an index of it. And it's also a natural or intrinsic relation between representamen and object, because the representamen actually physically unites both the representamen and the object. And like a child, again, it's an intrinsic natural relation of signness, could decipher this sign, yeah, by just looking at it. You can infer from the physical contiguity that the weathercock actually indicates the wind. And then we have the third sign, which is the most conventional and the least natural sign, a symbol. For instance, the Statue of Liberty has on its crown 7 spikes, and they actually stand for the 7 continents. This is an interpretant that society just decided to be that way. It's a convention. So there is no intrinsic relationship between the representamen and the object, because the code is a conventional code. This is also why a 2-year-old child could never understand the signness of a symbol, because if it's not familiar with the interpretant, it's something that you just have to learn. You cannot. So symbols also play some role in perceptions, but I believe that more important than icons and symbols is indexicality, and I believe this together with Peirce, and I will now explain to you why that is. So back to perception. Perception presents indexes to us, yeah, and this is my argument why the concept of reality is born in perception, in a specific way of perception. Why is that interesting when we talk about media and technology? Well, it's interesting because the idea behind perception as inherently indexical is that perception would be sufficient to equip us with a concept or an idea of reality, yeah? Which nota bene does not imply a belief in reality, just the concept of it. You first have to have the concept, then you can believe in the concept. And hence, maybe if a technology can reproduce the mechanism of perception, of indexical perception, then reality could be reproduced too. Yeah? But before we dive deeper into this and how it relates to photography and film and then possibly VR and other new technologies, I would like to familiarize you with some philosophical wording or concepts to better grasp theories of perception. And you might find this handy for your own perceptions in everyday life, but also maybe for your works with film. So there are 2 major concepts in Peirce's theory of perception, and we will work with those. The percept and the perceptual judgment. Yeah? A percept is the highly fugitive and non-cognitional or acognitional instance that initiates a perception. But the perceiving mind has no cognitional access to the percept, except through a second instance, and this is called the perceptual judgment. This perceptual judgment, our perceptual judgments in perception, follow immediately the occurrence of percepts, and they profess to represent the percepts. So if you like to consider an example, because it's all very abstract, imagine you're wandering the fields somewhere, and suddenly you perceive something moving on the horizon. Yeah? This would be a percept. And then as soon as you manage to judge what it is, we're already in the realm of the perceptual judgment, which would be, in my example, oh, there's a herd of cows running toward me from the horizon. Yeah? So Peirce was asking himself how the perceptual judgments come into existence. And his answer, and this is why it's interesting, implies indexicality but not iconicity. Yeah? There is no relationship of resemblance or analogy between the percept and the perceptual judgment, but there's only forceful connections between this first moment where we sense that there's something and the second moment where we manage to judge what it actually is that we see. So imagine again, you're standing there and all those big cows are running towards you really quickly. It's dangerous, yeah? They could even, you'll most likely get run over, or maybe they even kill you. So you have to produce a perceptual judgment in order to deal with the percept. This is the idea that's behind Peirce's indexical interpretation of perception. So I already said that there are only forceful connections between the percept and the perceptual judgment. And the perceptual judgment is, I quote from Peirce, a cognitive product of a reaction. Yeah? So note that for Peirce, reaction is first in perception, with cognition being the product of a reaction. Perception is a collateral experience of inner and outer world, which entails an instinctive cognitive adaptation to it, consisting in an uncontrollable automatic formation of a perceptual judgment. So now let's come back to the example of the herd of cows running towards you. Consider the following. 2 seconds after the completion of the perceptual judgment, oh, there's a herd of cows running toward me, you wake up and realize that this was not a real herd of cows running toward you, but just a realistic dream of a herd of cows. What does that change in terms of perception and cognition? At first sight, it could suggest itself that the ingredient of genuine indexicality, presupposing existent individuals, like in the example of the weathercock, the wind as a real physical existing force, or if you will, an individual, is not given in the case of dreams and hallucinations. Perhaps it is not even quite appropriate to speak of a percept at all here, if it's only a dream. But I have a nice metaphor by Peirce, who compares our consciousness to a bottomless lake. And this can give us some more ideas on how to understand the relationship between dreams and perceptions. So, well, I read this to you. We must imagine that there is a continual fall of rain upon the lake, our consciousness, which images the constant inflow of percepts in experience. All ideas other than percepts are more or less deep, and we may conceive that there is a force of gravitation, so that the deeper ideas are, the more work will be required to bring them to the surface. Or we may see that the depth represents the degree of energy of attention that is requisite to discern the idea at that depth. But it must not be thought that an idea actually has to be brought to the surface of consciousness before it can be discerned. To bring it to the surface of consciousness would be to produce a hallucination. So there's this bottomless lake, that's the consciousness. Percepts, real, genuine perception happens at the surface. Rain is continually falling on the lake, according to Peirce. And so this is where the percepts come into consciousness. And the deeper we go, the more we approach memories. And the higher up we are, the more we are in actual perception. So percepts are so vivid, genuine percepts, because they come to us via the surface of consciousness, where attention is always unintentionally high and dense. And then the deeper an experience lies in the depth of consciousness, the more attention must be applied to discern it in these depths. To bring an idea from the depth of consciousness to the surface of consciousness would amount to producing a hallucination. The same could probably be said for a great many of dreams, at least if they appear undeliberate, vivid, and realistic. Thus, the vividness, insistency, and involuntariness that hallucinations and dreams share with genuine perceptions can be explained in Peirce's image in terms of attentional substance. It's all water, yeah? So, and since our perceptual judgments happen to be made too at the surface of the lake of consciousness, it follows as a habit that whenever an idea or event causes motion or action on that surface, we believe it to emanate from a percept, almost like in Pavlovian conditioning. Yeah? The excited consciousness surface rings a bell, yeah, that makes us stand to attention with regards to external reality. We believe that it's external. But actually, we're inherently unable yeah, to immediately discern between inward and outward experiences. In order to become aware of the I cannot pronounce this very well, hallucinatory, where's the stress? This is English, hallucinatory. Good, great. Illusory or oniric character of a percipium. And percipium is the word which Peirce uses to describe the whole process. The percept occurs, the perceptual judgment interprets the percept, and the percipium summarizes them into one image. So, and in order to become aware that a percipium was just a dream, for instance, we have to wait. We have to wait for at least another percipium to occur that contradicts it. Yeah? Otherwise, we cannot necessarily tell. Some have lucid dreaming and know that they are dreaming, but usually you cannot, only from the phenomenology of the images, judge if you are in reality or not. So Peirce goes so far as to say that in regard to its relation to knowledge and belief, the percipium is nothing, I quote, but an extreme case of fancy. The percipium is, one could say, ontologically blind. The percipium is evident to the extent that what seems to seem really seems. And that's all we can actually say about it. So this is why there's this other quote where Peirce says, the percipium forces itself upon your acknowledgement without any why or wherefore, so that if anybody asks you why you should regard it as appearing so and so, all you can say is, I can't help it, that is how I see it. The percipium thus approaches the character of iconicity or indexicality. What is more prominent in it, according to you?
Can you repeat the question?
Is the percipium, does it approach in character the signness of iconicity or indexicality? Well, it's true, but the fact that we can only look at it and we look at it and it resembles something and it resembles what it resembles, it seems to seem, this is all very iconic. And that's the thing. So in Peirce's theory of perception, we have both things at stake. Between the percept and the perceptual judgment, we have the forceful connections, the index. But then the problem is that the result of perception, the percipium, does not give us any indication for reality because it becomes very iconic in the end. It's an image. As soon as we have the interpretation at hand, it's an image. This is why many think that actually perception is something like walking through a picture gallery. The thing that we just ruled out together with Peirce, he said it's not just a passing of images before the mind's eye. It's not just wandering through a picture gallery. It somehow is and isn't at the same time. So quite contrary to an iconic interpretation of the perceptual process, Peirce points out that, I quote again, the perceptual judgment is not a copy, icon, or diagram of the percept, however rough. He says this very clearly. End of quote. So according to him, there's no logical relation between perceptual judgment and percept, but as soon as we have a finished perceptual process with the percipium, there is some iconicity to it. Nevertheless, he stresses, and this is interesting for film realism, filmic realism, and realism in new technology. According to this theory of perception, every perception is accompanied by low degrees, at least low degrees of shock. So there is some shocking element to every genuine experience of perception. In order for percept or perceptual judgment to feel genuine and not oniric, we need a sense of externality, a presence of the non-ego. And that can happen between the Peirce and the perceptual judgment. There is the blow of it, a reaction of it against us. Remember the herd of cows running towards you. There's something we take for real. So an impression of indexicality is required in perception in order to distinguish it from dreaming, but it's never absolute. Yeah? of course, it can't be absolute because we can be totally convinced that we are about to genuinely perceive in a waking state, although we are still asleep. It happened to the best of us, and dreaming, as well as we can have an impression of irreality being wide awake. But in any case, and that's what I wanted to point out by giving you some introduction to this vocabulary, perceptual realism, and then later on also technological perceptual realism, seems to be intimately connected to the indexical ingredient of perception, to indexicality. And indexicality, you will see, can also be translated into aesthetics or stylistic devices of filmic aesthetics, for instance. So you may have noticed that in this philosophical foray, there was again, it appears to be peculiar to philosophical thoughts, a sort of paradox or contradictory moment, right? The interpretations of Peirce's theory of perception can go both ways, yeah? Some stress the iconic ingredient, and others, like me, stress the indexical ingredient. I have argued in another paper that iconicity cannot lend support, at least not in terms of realism and reality, to the process of perception, because iconicity is the sign, you have it on your handouts, of resemblance, yeah, of analogy. Nothing substantially new, nothing different from our own thinking or our own mental operations can be given through iconicity, because it relies on the resemblance of the perceived phenomena with something that's already known. Yeah? In other words, an icon is not a sign caused by an outward object, by an external reality that is different from the way we think. And it's a sign that's actually caused by the mind. So this seems to be at odds not only with the characterization of the percept as a non-ego, something that's different from the ego, but also with our definition of reality as being mind-independent. Genuine, meaningful perceptions surely include some iconicity, not, however, primarily in their qualitative sensorial part, but chiefly in their dualistic indexical character. The perceptual judgment and the percept are as separate and as fundamentally different as the wind and the weathercock in the example of an index. And only because perceptual experience is primarily indexical can perception actually be an informational process. So he clearly says it, a pure icon is of the nature of an appearance and as such, strictly speaking, exists only in consciousness. If perception would be iconic, and iconicity, strictly speaking, exists only in consciousness, perception could not have any connection to an outer world. It would only be a reproduction of our own consciousness. It would be something like the brain in the bed. So there remains only one way in which the perceptual judgment can represent the percept. This is a perce, namely as an index or true symptom, just as a weathercock indicates the direction of the wind, or a thermometer the temperature. I think that readings of Peirce, or any theories of perception that stress an iconic moment at the basis of perception, fail to account for realism and for our concept of reality that our common sense gives us. We would really find ourselves in a moment of pure dream if perception was predominantly iconic. So the Peircean definition of external realities and internal realities actually is very semiotic in nature. For him, external realities are, as I said, independent of what we think about them, but also independent of how we think. Whereas internal internal realities, such as dreams, yeah, are independent of what we think about them, but they are not independent of how we think. A dream is not independent of the way we think, but because we can have nightmares, dreams can be independent of what we think about them. So we have another degree of reality in dreams, internal realities as in external realities. And so this definition, yeah, is very semiotic in nature. Signs with an indexical predominance are more likely to be part of an external reality, and signs with a predominantly iconic or symbolic character usually feel less real. Yeah? Let's look now at two examples, filmic examples, where iconicity induces a fictional feeling rather than a realistic feeling. And the first, I have to stream this from Netflix, unfortunately. Hope it works quickly. Oh, it doesn't. It's just gone. Yay. Okay. Oh, there it is. I don't know if you have seen this Black Mirror episode, Hang the DJ.
To relationships to find it.
That is correct.
Great.
What was that?
Another relationship.
Already?
So the stone always hits the water 4 times, and this happens again later on. She throws it again, and where is it?
What is this?
This is Black Mirror, and it's the episode called Hang the DJ. She throws it again here. This.
Okay.
Yeah. 1 second, it's coming up. So it always hits the water 4 times. And again, right here. I hope I don't hit the scene that's just preceding it, which is not so nice.
Congratulations, Amy. Your ultimate match has been identified. Your parent day is tomorrow.
Ultimate is in the one.
Okay, yeah. It already happened. I'm sorry. I'm afraid I have to show you this terrible scene. No, great. So she becomes skeptical about the reality of what she actually lives because there's too much iconicity, too much analogy, too many signs qua resemblance. Things repeat themselves too often, which makes her
Congratulations,
skeptical.
Amy. Your ultimate match has been identified. Your parent day is tomorrow.
Ultimate is in the one.
That is correct.
And we meet tomorrow.
That is correct. Tomorrow you'll be coupled with your ultimate match, and together you will leave this place forever.
Okay. Are you allowed to tell me anything about them? Do I know them already?
Negative.
Right.
There is one more thing.
And what's that?
Prior to pairing day, you have been allocated a short farewell period with an individual of your choosing.
What, a farewell period like I get to say goodbye to someone?
That is correct. Data shows this can help provide psychological closure.
Frank, I choose Frank.
Your choice has been registered.
Wait, where are we meeting?
Usual booth 7:30 p.m.
Right. Coach,
Yes, Amy.
count to 4.
1, 2, 3.
How long we got? System set my parent day for tomorrow.
Me too.
I don't want whoever the system reckons the one is, okay? I want you.
I want you.
Failure to comply with the system may result
Oh,
in
you can
banishment.
fuck off alone.
Can you remember where you were before you came here? You can't, can you?
No?
Me neither.
Why can't I think of that?
It's a test. Do you remember the first night that we were together? I mean, the first night. How did you feel?
Oh, I felt safe, happy, comfortable. It felt right. It felt like something locked into place, you know? Like we met before.
Like it happened before and like it'll happen again, like it's happened 1,000 times over and over again. Do you know?
So So this is why I extended this until that moment. There's too much repetition in their perception. They perceive a world that is too analogous. Everything happens again and again, or seems to happen again and again. What this induces is a feeling of irreality. Like, I don't know if you remember this in The Matrix, when they have a déjà vu. This is the moment that something is being changed, and information is being changed in the Matrix. Yeah. So there too, the iconic, the analogous, is actually linked to something that is not real. So, and why do we have that feeling of irreality or of dissolution of reality when we perceive too much analogy? That's because the iconic is just a mental sign, yeah? And if we perceive the mental as being externalized in the world, yeah, the world is no longer what we conceive it to be, an external reality that is mind-independent, yeah? So when iconicity occurs on the level of the filmed, it's a clear indicator that there's a problem with the status of reality of the filmed. But now let's look at another example where iconicity is on the level of the perceiving technological dynamism. Yeah, not in the filmed world, but in the filmic material. We're looking at 3 stylistic devices that affect media realism in our next example. And the 3 stylistic devices are the music over, the slow motion, and the black and white. And we'll see how far they are iconic. Okay, I'm sorry for that. 1 second. Okay, so this is Lars von Trier. It's the censored opening passage, the prologue of the Antichrist. It's actually pretty good that it's censored. I hope it really doesn't show too much. Okay. So music as maybe the most iconic of all art forms. Some theorists even think it's a pure icon. Induces, of course, a perception of subjectivity, yeah? Because if you think of it, like meanings in music, the only meaning that you can get is through resemblance to subjective states of feelings or subjective images. So one could say that music renders, I'm sorry, why all those movies always about the one thing? Yeah, movies that have music over induce a more inward than outward perception of reality. And so does slow motion, that's indicating a subjective perception that does not follow the law of time in the external world. And of course, I'm sorry, it's not really censored, huh? It said censored. I just stop it, you get it, yeah? I'm sorry. And the black and white, of course, in modern times, like in modern times, it's also an indicator very often in film aesthetics of a subjective process. Sorry, let's just go to the next, yeah? So the black and white as an aesthetic configuration or as an indicator of a memory, which is also always a subjective state, would also fall under the category of the iconic. So are you ready for something more indexical, like more documentary? I hope that works. This is the Leviathan by Lucien Costin-Taylor and Verena Paravel? So you get the idea. It's really beautiful. I bet you all know it already. So, but what can help us here to understand this as a more indexical aesthetics is to bring in André Bazin, the French film critic and scholar or film theorist, whose call for objective reality, deep focus, and lack of montage, no editing, are linked to his belief that the interpretation of a film or scene should be left to the spectator. So we do have the impression here of a long shot. We have absence of montage. And what this reinforces is the indexical nature of the filmic, or more basic, of the photographic technology. Yeah? André Bazin is famous for having defined photography as something like, this is my wording, but this is the way everybody should understand him, as an automatic perceptual index, yeah? As an externalized perception that proceeds indexically in an objectively observable manner.
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, so he defined photography as an automatic perceptual index, an externalized perception that proceeds indexically in an objectively observable manner. I can send this to you if you want. I have a quote by him that says it more clearly. The photograph proceeds by means of the lens to the taking of a veritable luminous impression in light to a mold. As such, it carries with it more than mere resemblance, namely a kind of identity. And now you have to recognize the index in this definition, yeah? Not mere resemblance, not mere icon, but really a kind of identity, as in the weathercock, yeah? Where the representamen and the object become one. So in order for this identity between the gaze and the world to appear, or to appear to be at work, to put it differently, for the indexicality to have room in the film we just saw, or in the excerpt we just saw, in order for the indexicality to have something like a phenomenological room, the director must abstain from too many cuts, yeah? From a too heavy editing, which would reinforce the mental again. Yeah? Montage being an equivalent of putting things together in a rational or causal manner, or interpreting manner at least. So only on this basis then, yeah, the sensory dimension of Castaigne-Taylor's and Paravel's documentary can convey the sensation of actually being there, of being indexically connected with the seen world. The water almost splashes into the camera and into our faces. I mean, there's hardly a steady shot, and it says that some viewers, the film has even made some viewers seasick. I don't know if that's true, but it's a great movie, and it has a great effect. There were unfixed cameras, and they actually enabled them to capture the constant movement, yeah, of being at sea. And that vividly, indexically, shockingly, yeah, forcefully evokes the converging forces. It really contains the indexical shocks, the unexpected, and the rough, the external reality, so to say. And yet, another film theorist, Christian Metz, I don't know if you know him, he's not that famous, but should be more famous. He
used to be famous.
Used to be famous, that's true, exactly, right? Yeah, the good times of structuralism are over. But he famously stated, every film is a fiction film. What did he mean by that? Yeah, he did not mean that every film is already an interpretation. What he actually was alluding to is the highly iconic material of the filmic art. Filmic technology has the capacity to disappear in perception. Yeah? The filmic look, so to say, onto the film world is so probable. Yeah? It's in itself so iconic, so analogous to our own ways of looking at the world, that we often put films on like a phenoprosthesis, like a phenomenological prosthesis, yeah? Through which we then perceive. Yeah? We do not perceive the perception, the technology, but we perceive through it. We use it as a prosthesis. And And that's why Metz said that every film is a fiction film because it operates with a very fictional, actually iconic technology. But then there's this other quote that you also have on your handout and that I would love to discuss. That's actually what I would have loved to do, only discuss this for an hour, because I think it's really interesting and it's not as straightforward as you might be tempted to think when you read it for the first time. The filmic verisimilitude is to be sought at the level of the living and constructing dynamism of perception, and not at that of the objective data of the perceived situation, because the film envelopes in the same segment a perceived instance and a perceiving instance. Many movements of apparatus consist in delivering an improbable object to a probable look. And this is where I think, we should place realism on that level. The probable look is what is important. The objects can be improbable. As long as the look onto the objects is probable, we will still have a realistic effect. But how this is really compatible with Metz also saying every film is a fiction film is to be questioned. Maybe you want to talk about that afterwards, or just think about it. So what I also found interesting, and what I want to point out now quickly, is that all those effects that movies and photographs have on us cannot be fully understood unless we acknowledge that those technologies, when they had been invented, have caused a fundamentally different epistemology. Yeah? The enrichment of the world by a perceptual automat that operates with a gaze that is able to spatio-temporally move through this world, just like us, has brought about, and that's important for philosophy, a validation of our own perceptions as being objectifiable, reproducible, and hence not only realistic, but real. Yeah? Not just iconic, but also indexical. Yeah? With the advent of photography and film, the things we can acquire reliable knowledge about have been extended significantly, not only because of a new type of a visual signifié, this is the object, or we could say a new image object, but also, and more importantly, by a new type of visual signifiant or representamen, yeah? Namely an externalized and materialized perception. This is what photography was in the first place, and this is how we still understand filmic images and photographic images. In the art of cinema, perception appears as reified, or in philosophers' terms, like Peirce's and Kant's terms, as hypostatized, substantialized. Hypostatization consists in turning something that we usually think through into something we think about. Yeah? Or if we perceive with our senses, and we can suddenly have something like a perceptual apparatus in the world, this will allow us to think about this thing with which we usually just think or perceive. We can turn it into an object that we can think about and not just use it as a medium. Hence, film can be defined as the hypostatization of our perceptions, and instead of only using the perceptions as something we think through or perceive through, we encounter in the filmic medium perceptual forms as subjects we can think about. And this, until the advent of photography, wasn't possible. There was nothing like this type of image. Yeah? Images were purely iconic, building their effectiveness only on resemblance. Yeah? There was no indexical technology at the bottom of it. Before the arrival of photography, then, human perception was the only realm where images of presentation, in contrast to mere representation, were produced, yeah? Or where a natural indexicality appeared to be at work. And as we have seen, reality and the reality of indexicality in perception have been put into question by numerous philosophers, from Plato through Descartes, Berkeley to Kant and others. But then, with the advent of photography, it was more difficult to do that, because at least we have something like an externalized perception in apparatus, so that it was all of a sudden more difficult to challenge the reality of our perceptions. Clearly, then, the invention of the camera plays an important role in the idealism and realism debate. The arrival of photography in our human history must be regarded as, in and of itself, a revolutionary fact, which phenomenologically and epistemologically speaking has induced significant changes for humanity, I want to say. With Bazin, André Bazin, that I just mentioned, we can come to a better understanding of how phenomenologically inexperienced and epistemologically inconceivable the objectivity of photography, cinema, and phonography had once been. In his famous article, The Ontology of the Photographic Image, he makes this very clear to us. And there he also gives us this nice quote. I don't know if this is actually also on your handouts or not. It has been translated in a wrong way many times. Photography affects us like a natural phenomenon, like a flower or a snowflake whose vegetable or earthly origins are an inseparable part of their beauty. It had been translated as photography affects us like a phenomenon in nature, which is wrong. And also we could even translate it better than I did it here, because the en tant que in French is as. It affects us really as a natural phenomenon, not like a natural phenomenon in nature, but truly as something that is natural, but it is also technology at the same time. So this means that, according to Bazin, photography and consequently film are not only capable of presenting images to us that have earthly origins, and that are hence indexically produced images of the world, but more media philosophically speaking, appear themselves as natural phenomena. And this is what Bazin wants to point out when he states that there is a natural character at the root of photography, which fills us with the same metaphysical wonder or ontological wonder as the beauty of a flower or that of a snowflake. Why is this point so important? Because the metaphysical or ontological wonders of beauty that Bazin is talking about here, and that philosophers have been century-long attributing to nature exclusively, are now being attributed to technology. Reality and technology merge, and because the technology, if we understand it as a translation of the natural and vice versa, and of some transcendental human features as consciousness or perception, might at some point, and maybe already today, be materialized enough, and by that I mean developed to maturity, sufficiently externalized and polished, that we can study it like an object in a lab and infer back from it to the transcendental features with which it shares properties, because it ultimately stems from them. So in this quote, Bazin is then not talking, of course, about the beauty of a single photograph, for instance, a photograph of a flower or of your loved ones. No, rather he's talking about the astonishment that any photograph arouses in us, and then that any film arouses in us, and then maybe that any virtual reality experience can arouse in us, depending on how high the degree of presence and immersion is. Because if it's too low, it doesn't work, but if it's too high, it doesn't work either. It's the media-specific effect that we have here in a theoretical reflection. The metaphysically inspiring amazement that formerly was the exclusiveness of natural phenomena of the real can now be felt for a technology. Technology and nature have become one. Now, the more than a century-long exposure to indexical images, photography and films, has, I believe, instigated a habit of two new beliefs in us. Has instigated in us a habit of two new beliefs. First, the habit to more firmly and scientifically believe in the objectifiable reality of the perceived world. And second, the habit to spontaneously believe that any highly iconic picture of photographic aesthetic quality is always the product of an indexical technique, and consequently one with external reality. To some degree, we could say then that the invention of photography and later of film has cleared the intricacies of iconicity and indexicality in perception. But there's also a danger. And this danger, Bazin actually already alludes to it in the 50s, in the 1950s. He calls it cinéma total, yeah? When he alludes to a future where the filmic art will turn into what he calls cinéma total, which would have peeled off then any artistic value and thus result in a mere return to reality. That would be the perfect immersion through VR, for instance. The cinéma total would not be realistic anymore. It would have become reality. And this is what the technology of virtual reality promises to deliver, when the feeling of presence in a VR environment will eventually be perfect. But Bazin already, he alluded to all of this already in 1951, where he visionarily pointed to the social and psychological dimensions of pseudo-presences, or he calls them also virtual presences, or again abstract presences, that, I quote, result from the scientific techniques for reproduction created by photography. And so he reasons, for the man in the street, the word presence today can be ambiguous. Hence, it is no longer as certain as it was that there is no middle stage between presence and absence. And with this quote in mind, we can have a quick look, and we're almost done, at Matsuda's hyperreality. Who of you know this clip? Not all of you, that's great. And
Voy lo más rápido que puedo. Seguro que no hay más trabajos disponibles. Estoy preparando el profesor y estoy haciendo mercados.
Y además puedes quedarte con los puntos de fidelización. Eres una máquina formal. Tienes que confiar en la aplicación. Te sientes inspirada. Gracias. Chao.
¿Quién soy yo? No, eso no es lo que quiero decir. ¿Para dónde voy? No, puedo volver a empezar. Olvídalo. Ay, no, cállate.
synchronicity, actually.
Buen día, Emilio. ¿Qué puedo hacer por usted? ¿Qué está pasando? Mis puntos están bien. No se preocupe, sus puntos están seguros conmigo. ¿Le puedo ayudar en algo más, Emilio? Yo no soy Emilio, yo soy Juliana Restrepo. Por favor, espere.
Hola, Juliana Restrepo. Me alegra verte. ¿Qué puedo hacer por ti?
Mis puntos están bien. ¿Qué está pasando?
Tranquila, todo está bien. Parece que alguien está intentando vulnerar su cuenta. Por favor, espere mientras reinicio su dispositivo.
We have an index, the crying baby. No, I can see that one. Nice and homey again.
Hola, Juliana. Me alegra verte. Hoy te ves hermoso. ¿Estás estrenando zapatos?
Ya lo arreglaron. Tengo que seguir trabajando.
Estoy trabajando en eso, pero necesito verificar tu información biométrica. Por favor, sigue la línea azul hasta el centro de servicio más cercano para confirmar tu identidad.
Sí, pero mis puntos están bien.
Todo está bien. Chao.
¿Qué hago? ¿Qué es eso?
Okay, so besides all those interesting things that are in there, I believe that there's a difficulty to decide if the injury has taken place merely as a part of the iconically structured AR interface, that is, as an illusion of indexicality in order to exert mental, or more precisely phenomenal perceptual power over the protagonist or the experiencer, or if it has taken place de facto. And the latter is without doubt the more common interpretation of this scene. Matsuda's video is thus read as a vision of a future where part of the people will be technologically controlled in a way that disrespects what we understand as basic human rights. On the other hand, putting into doubt the reality of the attack, and hence the reality of the index, is a more media philosophically oriented interpretation of this scene. I claim that the spectator's difficulty, if he has it, the difficulty, I do, to decide between those two possibilities stems from an indexical iconical confusion that would not have been possible in the year 1800, that is, before the advent of photography. The arrival of photography in our human history must be regarded as, in and of itself, a revolutionary fact, which phenomenologically and epistemologically speaking has induced significant changes for humanity and for our perceptions and epistemologies. So some conclusions for virtual reality documentary, for instance, or augmented reality documentary, would be that the perfect immersion, the gapless presence, especially if presence is defined as tantamount to successfully supported action in the environment rather than simply as the sense of being in a virtual environment rather than in the place in which the participant's body is actually located. That this gapless presence, or a gapless presence that we could strive for, always needs indexes, shocks, in order to transmit a feeling of realness. And what I hope my talk has made clear, or at least a little bit clear, is that it is the more crucial question of how these shocks, how these indexes, this otherness, the non-ego, can be made apparent qua technology than the question of how it will be made apparent in the filmed or experienced worlds. The perception is what must remain indexical and not necessarily the perceived. And that's what I wanted to give you on the way. And I'm done. Thanks for listening. Yeah.
I have 1,000 questions.
Oh, good.
And I'll spare you 990. And first of all, I appreciate, it's the move from philosophy to things in the world is a very tricky space. And,
Sure, yes.
And so I applaud you for making that move. A couple of really quick things, like almost finished my dissertation in philosophy, symbolic logic, so I understand the problem
Yes.
of like what your frame of reference is and how that kind of leads you down the path.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I would say is, you can go from at least good to on, where when pressing the eye, what's the reality status of what happens?
Mm-hmm.
Is vision inherently indexical?
Mm-hmm.
Why the camera when we have the camera obscura, which already relays the world on the surface, 15th century onwards? Like, I think that argument is much earlier than the literal photographic cameras.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
The argument, Rudolf Arnheim's argument in a way, with Bazin, or it's not about deep. Every photographic image has 1,000 variables that kind of preclude access to the real. And where I would look, so just where I don't know if you've seen Peter Gallison and Lorraine Daston's book on objectivity.
Yes.
But what they chart is a history of rejection of your argument by scientists across, from astronomy through people looking at blood to people looking at snowflakes, saying the photograph is not real. The photograph does not see what our eye sees. They inscribe all the limitations of vision. The 10th of a second problem that Jimenez Canales writes about, our eyes can't really process faster than that, or what we know to be the case versus what the photograph shows to be the case, and the photograph is incorrect, they claim. A photograph will show an asymmetrical snowflake. A photograph will show a splash that's asymmetrical, and we know reality is it is symmetrical. So that debate plays out through really to the end of the 19th century, before photography finally gets a little traction. That's 60 or 70 years of photography being rejected by the community that is most committed to talking about the objective world and what is reality. So I find that
Yeah, thanks.
really
The question
interesting.
is,
It's a non-philosophical endeavor.
No. The question is great. I don't know if I respond to this sufficiently if I say that, well, my concern was not with what photographs can show us and that they can be used as proofs for an external reality, but that they can be, but that the technique, and this also goes back to your first question, why not talking about the camera obscura? The difference is that photography is a technology that we can touch and that we can use, and we can look at it as an externalized perception. So what I wanted to say is that the invention of photography gave us the objective reality of our perceptions, not of the percipua, of the plural of percipuum, not of the objectivity or scientificity of the interpretations of our perceptions, but really only about the material of our perception that is totally fallible and remains fallible in photography and in perception.
But if we go back to if we go back to Fox Talbot, one of the first British photographer, he uses two radically different techniques. He puts things on paper and exposes light, and has an imprint of the thing.
Yeah.
And then he works with an objective, a lens.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a conceit, because that could be something we even recognize as an image or not recognize it. That's all about the optics. The other thing, you might have an argument.
Mm-hmm.
There's an impression.
Mm-hmm.
That's about
Exactly,
as
yeah.
far as the case. But with what we would call a photograph, not just a blueprint,
Mm-hmm.
the problem is all that stuff that's in between.
Yeah, okay, I see where your question goes. It's true. I mean, the farther we go away from the production of it, and the closer we get to the result of photography, the photograph that we can hold in our hands and look at, the farther we also go away from indexicality and from my whole argument. Absolutely.
And this takes me to VR.
Okay.
Depends
Yes.
on the technology, of course, but if you're talking about a LiDAR-based system, little laser points of light, even if I were to see the argument about indexicality with the photo, here you've got a really interesting dilemma, because you have absolutely, as good a case as you can
Yes.
come up with for indexicality with
Yes.
each of those little points,
Yes.
but they are nothing but a number printout
Yes, I know.
until an algorithm,
Yes.
and that's total, that is
I anticipated this
Good.
argument. No, it's true. I didn't have the time to go into detail. What I just wanted to say by this very actually media archaeological talk is that the invention of photography and film and this long exposure to those media both have changed our perception and our way of thinking about our own perception of images. It has even changed the ways in which we believe in images. And so when we are exposed to an image created by VR technology, what I'm interested in is how we react to it, how we interpret it in terms of realness, not objectivity of what we see, but through what we get it, if we actually believe in it or not. Let's say a priori, before the empirical data come in, no matter what we get to see in VR, I believe that we now have this habit to that's what I wanted to say. We assume that there is some indexical connection at the basis of realistically seeming images. Because we have started from the shock of the advent of photography. This was like a shock for epistemology.
Okay, well, that's just last thing to say.
Yeah.
I can't shut up. That's why I think the scientific discourse is so important, because they actually actively dispute that and say, no, this has no bearing on the real. Number one, and that's across the board, and that book is like that thick and full of it.
Well, I'll read it.
Number two, the whole 19th century, all these tropes of ectoplasm, all the disappearing people, retouching as an active practice where photographs are retouched because I want to look better. That's not indexicality, that's malleability. That's like, I understand this is a representation of me and I want it to look a little better.
That's not what I wanted to talk about at
Well,
all.
What I'm saying
this
is simply to say that cultural association you're arguing for, that you say is being extended to VR, about some correlation to the world,
but
that's a
okay,
fiction.
but if you look at such a manipulated photograph, let's put it like this, do you actually believe it or not?
Some people do, some people don't.
Do you?
It depends how manipulated it is.
But if you don't know about the manipulation, you don't know anything about the manipulation, you just see it. What's your first?
No, because I
Okay, well, okay, you don't, but right. Okay, but what I want to say is that most people out there have the habit to associate some kind of reality as soon as we have photographic realism.
Look at the courts. There's legal discourse where photographs as evidence are disputed endlessly.
No, but that's not what I'm saying. Evidence for our perception and not evidence for anything that we can perceive. Only for the way we perceive, not what we perceive.
That recursive move has been trumped in the era of the digital, where we have a completely new model.
Yeah, but I'm saying that the analogous has shaped our perceptions in a way that we believe the digital to be analogous. That's what I actually wanted to say. But all of your arguments are, of course, very important, and that would have made my talk much more complex. Yeah, if I take this into account, I really wanted to focus on the production and only the perceptual, the material of it. not. I know we cannot really dissociate form from content, but if we could, and I mean theoretically we can, then I've been talking about form, not the contents of photography or perception, only the forms with which we approach it. Yeah, yeah.
Kind of relating to your idea of reality and of the ego and of presence, experienced meditators that have meditated for many hours say of their experience of reality as a sort of dream, as a sort of story. So how does that, it's kind of a question, kind of a thought that I've been thinking throughout this whole talk about reality is like not always what it seems, right? And so even right now, this moment is not what it seems. There's like thousands of things that we can't perceive, thousands of things that are going on below the surface. How does that apply to what you're talking about? How does that relate to this idea of index ecology and icon?
Yeah, well, I think it doesn't really apply to it very directly, more indirectly, because what you're talking about, if I understand it correctly, is more the interpretation of reality, that every perception of reality, but not in the strict sense of perception, but every reception of reality, yeah, is individual and subjective. And it also depends on the phenomenological equipment with which we come. A fly has a different perception, of course, of the reality than we do. So this is, I think that's a level that I have not been talking about, and we could talk about that, and definitely also link in some way iconicity and indexicality to it, I'm sure, but I haven't really thought about that.
It feels relevant to me in that, as you know, when we're making documentaries, we're thinking about the multiple ways we personally can perceive things and those layers, and also about the ways that then we represent it. So it feels that both in terms of the representation and in terms of the interpretation, there is a kind of...
Absolutely. Okay, so maybe, thanks for extending the question. I think now I have a better answer maybe. What I really wanted to point out is that I believe that there's multiple ways of understanding reality, of representing reality in your films, for instance. The choices, those are your choices, maybe symbolic choices too. But if you want to achieve some realism with new technology, I believe that one clue is to focus on the media realism that you can create. And this will also make you more free for presenting the worlds, showing different worlds, or for choosing which world you want to present. The thing is, how do you present it, with which technology, and how can you make the aesthetic devices with which you look at the world, or with which you make the experience the world, more indexical and less iconic. Yeah, because this would be what leads you to media realism according to this theory, if you follow it. Yeah. So indexes are more important than icons, and music would probably not lead to such a high realism as the absence of montage. Dennis Tortum, I think, has he actually written his, he also, when he writes about embodied montage, he also concludes that montage is going against realism. Montage actually is not very helpful if you want to create a feeling of reality or realism. So this has all been about how we have to look for indexicality and the absence of iconicity in the medium itself, and not so much the shown worlds.
In the data capture.
Exactly.
I mean, back to LiDAR scanning. It sounds like, so you're arguing that photography was this sort of progression of data capturing and sort of indexicality, right? Do you think we're progressing further as we develop these new technologies like AI, VR, AR, where do they, is it a sort of progressive indexicality in terms of the
No, I
data
believe-
capture, or are we going backwards?
Yeah, that's a question, but I believe that indexicality is less and less at stake, and iconicity is more at stake.
So what's more
We still, iconicity, we still profit, that's what I wanted to say, from this habit to believe that at the root of iconic images, there's a relation with the world, an index. But at some point, probably will be, you know, in the cinema total, and then it won't be about realism anymore. It will be reality 2.0. And then I don't know if we start again from where Plato and all the other philosophers started from, you know.
So just so I can understand, so you're making an argument that we're going kind of backwards, and William, you're saying that we never really got there with photography or film.
Right, I'm saying, yeah, I mean, there are plenty of people who would argue that Rodin, in the arts world and the science world, would just say, sorry, photography's correlation to reality is not present, it's not there. Something else is at stake here. And
Yeah, okay,
yeah, and you know, so you made a distinction earlier, you sort of asked the question about verisimilitude versus fiction, which is an odd distinction to make, because Citizen Kane has plenty of verisimilitude, but it's fiction. I mean, verisimilitude, I would say, is a style, and fiction is a different ontological category. In fact, in fiction, work on one axis, and verisimilitude and its opposite, hyperconstructionism, work on a different axis.
But you're talking about Citizen Kane, and I assume you're talking about the perceived worlds, what you can see.
What I'm talking about,
because this is the realism.
What Rozan talks about is perceptually, I have a long take and deep focus.
Yes.
My eye can wander, I can make sense of this as I can the world.
Yeah.
I think there's plenty of empirical evidence coming from the world of, the optics that actually our eye doesn't work that way. That our eye is constantly framing. If you look at those eye trackers on computers, our eye doesn't gaze at the screen. Our eye is constantly jolting from point to point to point, kind of in a montage style. Now, all I'm saying is
but
there
then you are doing the interpretation that usually the montage does. Exactly, yeah. But you are doing it and not the montage.
This plays totally against Bazan's notion of.
But the verisimilitude was Metz, right? And this is, it's just interesting, I guess, for me. The verisimilitude for him is on the perceiving level and not on the perceived level. And it's not very easy to grasp, I guess. But
well, it's very cultural. The problem is, and that's right, a lot to do at the beginning, because it's a daring move to go from a kind of the internal consistencies of a philosophical system. Whichever system you choose, it's internally consistent, and that's great. That's why I did symbolic logic. It was really pure. But the moment you broker that into a space of materiality that's culturally coded, words like verisimilitude, words like perception, suddenly have a kind of historical and cultural weight.
Yeah, of course.
Look at the way the photograph works. Anthropologists have talked a lot about it, or film, on first encounters to some tribe in the middle of Brazil. It doesn't work the way. They don't see the image. They see a surface.
Yeah, because they they don't have the habit. I'm talking about.
And habit is culture.
Totally,
and culture is a very
absolutely.
thing.
No, this is granted. Absolutely,
And
it
that's
only
why-
works for the cultures who have the habit.
And so
of course,
here I'm pointing to the culture of artists like Rodin and the culture of scientists, both of whom are charged with the task of representing the real. So if I were to look anywhere for a kind of discursive critique of the status of the image, iconic or indexical, I would look at people who specialize in articulating that. And as far as I'm concerned, the arts world and the science world are two professions whose business it is to talk about the real. So those are interesting discursive entry points to.
Yeah. And I would very much be interested in that too, but the real, the status of the real of perception only, and not the real out there, because that's something it's so vast, and this is even, I think, more cultural than just, looking at how real is perception and how real are the images of perception, which might be more transcendental than you want it to be.
But again, both of these, I wouldn't reduce science or the arts to the thing, because both of them are involved and articulate about the process, about the perceptual act.
That's true.
Not just the perceived. So don't reduce me
that's
to
true.
the perceived.
Yes, okay, I don't.
Is talking about perception, and these scientists are talking about perception.
I know, yeah, that's true.
So it's a relevant discourse if one is going to then talk about in a cultural argument that says this is what we believe and this is how we perceive.
Absolutely, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I don't think we do, or at least these groups don't.
Okay.
Or it's just perception.
Okay, thank you so much.
Any other questions?